right, hello everyone that's joining. We're just starting to let people into the webinar and we will wait a few moments and then we'll get started. Well, hi everybody that's joining. We're just going to give this another minute or two to let the rest of the attendees join. All right, so it's 2:31. I know we'll probably have a few more attendees join as we get started, but we will go ahead and get started with our program. Hi, everyone. I'm James Brown, Executive Director of the STEM Education Coalition. Welcome to our briefing, our first coalition briefing virtually, and it's on a very virtual topic of virtual internships. So we're going to explore that issue, and we've got a great set of panelists in front of you, and we will go ahead and get right into it. So the format of this briefing will be brief presentations by each of our panelists, followed by some question and answer. And of course, anybody can chime in with questions during the chat while we're going, but we will hold the questions until we get to the end of the presentations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank DeVecchis, who's Director of University Relations, Diversity and Inclusion at Merck, for some introductory remarks. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you very much, James. Really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be with you all here virtually. This afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are with us. I thought I'd talk a little bit about our experience with virtual internships at Merck this summer, and a little bit about the importance that we've seen as a result of that. In the early days of the pandemic here in the U.S., late March, early April, we started hearing some noise from hiring managers with the best intentions. They were a bit panicked, and they were calling us and saying that they wanted to cancel internships, predominantly those that were lab and plant-based, so that students that were signed up for them could have an opportunity to find something else to do this summer, something that was better suited to their professional and educational needs. We pushed back on that immediately for a few reasons. Number one, we know, and I think we're all everyone on this call would agree, we know that internships are good preparation for full-time roles, and they are excellent discernment opportunities for further career paths or deciding whether or not to continue with education. And so we knew that at that time, if we were to cancel internships, we'd been hearing from a number of our peers that there wasn't anything else out there. And so we wanted to make sure that if we truly believe that internships were as valuable as we think that they are, that we were doing everything that we can to give individuals that opportunity. We in the pharmaceutical industry have certainly been feeling the economic pressures from COVID, but perhaps slightly less so than our peers in a number of other industries. And so to the extent that we were able to do so, we wanted to make sure that we kept those programs. The second thing that we were saying to hiring managers is we recognize that a lot of that initial panic was driven by fear, and fear is driven by the unknown, right? They were looking at bringing on an intern for potentially 10 weeks over the summer, making that experience purely virtual. They'd never done anything like that before, and they thought they were going to be alone in that process. But candidly, we were hearing from dozens of hiring managers that were going through the same thing. And so we said, you're not in this alone. We're all facing this together. So we pulled together teams of managers. We talked to some colleagues in learning and development. And we started pulling together content that maybe was traditionally delivered in an in-person format, or some content that was siloed within certain divisions, pulling it all together into a generalized SharePoint site for our internship community. And we wound up, just by collating the information that already existed and digitizing some things that we were planning on doing anyway, we wound up pulling together more than 40 hours of content that we were able to give to our hiring managers to take some of that stress of onboarding new employees off their shoulders and spread some of the work of bringing those interns around a bit. Once we had that underway, once those resources were in place, we became strong advocates for 100% virtual internships. And the reason that we were going that route is, as I'm sure a lot of you are facing right now, we are practicing not only all of the recommendations that the CDC has put out there, but we are also engaging in contact tracing and isolation. So that if an individual who had been exposed to COVID were to come on site, especially into a lab or a manufacturing facility, you could be looking at having to quarantine an entire division as a result. And we knew that if that were to be an intern who were to contract COVID on site, or an intern who were to bring COVID on site, we knew that would likely be the end of the internship program as we knew it. And so we did that once we had put the virtual curriculum in place. We braced ourselves to see what was going to happen, and of the 470 internships that we had initially put out there this summer, I'm happy to report that we are delivering on 465. There were only 5 very specific lab-based internships that we had to walk back on. So it's doable, it's possible. It's hard work, but it's work that a lot of us are doing together and are willing to share best practices around. And we know that it's valuable and important. We've learned quite a bit along the way. All things being equal, we prefer to be doing this in person. I don't think there's anybody that's going to disagree with that. But I will say that from what we've learned, I do strongly believe that much of this will be carrying on into future summers, into future experiences, so that we will be doing things differently as a result of what we're learning throughout the entirety of the process. And most importantly, we've invested in the future scientists, engineers, and business professionals that are going to be driving our business in the years forward. And we are glad that we were still able to give them a good summer experience, and we look forward to them joining our workforce shortly thereafter. So James, with those words of introduction, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Very, very interesting. So now I'm going to turn it over to Michael Ellison, CEO and founder of Codepath.org.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here and giving me an opportunity to share what we do. First, I'm going to share my screen. So first, I'll share just a little bit of background about Codepath. So Codepath is an education nonprofit, and we focus on increasing diversity in software engineering roles, specifically by systemically changing what's being taught and how it's being taught across computer science programs nationwide. We partner with major technology companies. We work with faculty and students, training them a semester advance to then put new curriculum on their campuses. And then when the courses are running, we actually are helping to run the courses, doing grading, student support, homework help. And lastly, we also are a pipeline into the industry where we do direct connections to employers. In the background of Codepath, we've also run a lot of training programs internally, created Airbnb's first ever engineer onboarding program, redesigned Facebook's global engineer onboarding program, and we're actually running a virtual internship program for Facebook this summer. So I have a lot of thoughts on this area and very excited to share. We have achieved a decent level of scale, 50 plus colleges and universities in the past year. Many of those universities, minority serving institutions, historically Black colleges and universities. So we have a good lens into what is happening, how COVID and is affecting our students from low income, underrepresented backgrounds. And that's the area that I'm most interested in sharing and speaking to today. So when we think of virtual internship opportunities, I think that internships in general, they're our best opportunity in order to decrease attrition in computer science, but then also to prepare our students for early career success. Many students from underrepresented backgrounds are much more likely to drop out of computer science programs. Many CS programs we see on college campuses are designed almost to filter students out because they tend to emphasize students who have already had prior exposure to programming courses in high school. And then when students do successfully stay in a CS program, there's a huge gap with industry that even the best colleges and universities tend not to fill. So as an example, imagine if you're taking a writing course, you're limited to writing 1,000 words, when in industry you're expected to work with these gigantic documents that have millions of words in them. That's an example of a disconnect of what it's like doing theoretical work in the classroom versus on-the-job performance in a software engineering role. There's also a major difference in what is being taught. Popular technologies like iOS or Android or cybersecurity, very few campuses, even top schools, are emphasizing these to an industry standard. Also, one of the biggest disconnects we see is that when students teach themselves, they still don't know what it's like to collaborate in a professional engineering environment. So we call this these soft skills, but focus on software engineering in particular, where it really sets students behind if they end up going to one of the many schools where it's not common to have internships over the course of your undergraduate experience. I'll give one example in case in point. So Herman Flores, first generation, low-income college student, and grew up in a very tough background, multiple times evicted in foster care. He is currently a senior where he is supporting his brother, sister, their kids, and their nieces. He came close to dropping out many times because it's been hard for him to get an internship, and he's had to work full-time in school. So students like Herman, they end up becoming sometimes the largest breadwinners in their families. So an internship, especially early in their career, can significantly impact not just their own life, but also the livelihood of their entire family, as well as also helping them to persist, to complete their degree, and it's a pathway for them to actually become successful. Last area I want to comment on is that COVID has created this really unique and interesting moment where companies that previously these internships were on campus, you had to move there, you had to have more access. Now we see these virtual internship programs that are able to potentially scale dramatically. And internships are the primary source of entry-level hires for companies. So if we can diversify those by making them more equitable, more accessible to students from a wider variety of backgrounds, then it's a pathway to actually diversifying the industry. There's also challenges in that when you're thinking of designing an effective online environment or virtual environment, you actually need more support, more mentorship, not less. So there's big opportunities in this moment. There's also major challenges depending on how well we design these experiences for our students. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Much appreciated. Now we're going to turn to Erica Beskar, who is Central Analog Test and Validation Director at Texas Instruments.
Thank you, James. I'm very excited to be here with all of you. I'm representing TI, and I wanted to discuss with you how we are using this opportunity to provide an impactful internship experience virtually within TI. And before I start with that, I just wanted to provide you an overview of TI. Just a reminder, probably all of you know that TI is a big employer in Dallas. And probably you have heard that we make calculators. Well, that's true. We actually are a company of 14 billion in revenue, and we employ 30,000 people worldwide, and we operate in over 30 countries. And our engineers are designing semiconductor for electronics objects that you experience and use every day. Right. So one of the things that I also wanted to mention is that we invest in local education and we fund STEM programs, and we are on a mission to really increase the number of students with access to quality education within our local communities. So now into the internship strategy as a result of COVID-19. So every summer in TI, we hire hundreds of interns with diverse backgrounds and that are qualified for a variety of roles in TI. Now in 2020, this year in March, our TI offices were closed due to COVID except for essential workers. So in April, we made the decision to transition all summer 2020 internships from an on-site in the office experience to a virtual one. So how did we do this, right? We created a small working team to create a plan and align intern roles and projects. And we also pull in specific TI teams across the company that help us provide structure, training, infrastructure, and tools for both interns and supervisors. This involved creating a new TI level training material for all interns. And in addition, we work with an IT and businesses to ship laptops and equipment necessary for the intern projects. So what we wanted to make sure that we did not compromise was the quality, and we wanted to provide a seamless experience for interns and supervisors that will fit TI workforce needs. One thing that was really helpful this summer was engaging the interns through social media. I mean, it's really no surprise for us that this is a generation that lives in social media, and they were able to use this to create a sense of community across themselves. And also through that, we were able to hear how excited they were that TI was able to carry forward with the internship program this summer virtually, when some of other corporations were really not able to sustain the internship just due to COVID, right? So that was very encouraging to hear. Now, internally to TI, we created an internship portal with all information that was needed for our interns to be successful, all the information in one place. That include welcome videos, resources for them to do their job well, impactful events, including training, seminars, and diversity and inclusion events. As you probably know, TI does have a TI diversity network. And for example, just last Friday, our interns were invited to an event hosted by our TI diversity network to discuss how we move forward and address racial injustice. And the interns really like this event, right? Because we feel in TI these conversations are crucial. In TI, we believe diversity fuels innovation, and we really want to make sure every single person feels included so they can give the best to TI and to their work, right? Going back now to the STEM portion or on some of our engineering disciplines, I think Frank mentioned that with the virtual internships, there's some complexity because sometimes we need to provide a hands-on experience to our interns, and that requires access to the lab, equipment, hardware, so they can develop measurement techniques. So for some of those disciplines, we really had to think outside the box to figure out how can we use simulators that we have created internally in TI so we can emulate hardware and still provide that opportunity to the interns to really learn how to program a test solution in order for them to test a device in TI. In fact, just last week, I was talking to one of my interns who told me how excited he was about this project because he will be learning both the design tools and the test tools, and that was fitting an experience that really he wanted to get this summer. So has been encouraging so far. So with that, just to summarize here, we have created a virtual internship toolkit that can be easily scaled and repurposed by TI regional communicators, HR, talent acquisition teams to drive global consistency with the internship program, but of course, adding the local need. And one of the things that I just wanted to close with is that what seemed like a big undertaking back in April has actually become really rewarding for all of us at TI. We feel that we were able to keep an internship with a great quality. One of the things that we learned is that we had to really put some more structure and online information to make this successful. So looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Next, thank you, Erica. Next, we will go to Latrice Garrison, who is Executive Vice President at the American Chemical Society.
Thank you, James, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I will share my screen. Okay, so briefly today, I'd like to share with everyone some of the pivots that we've made from a virtual perspective, given COVID's showing itself to us and forcing us to really think differently about how do we do our day-to-day operations and how can we continue to service our community. So one of our key things that we first started doing, and this has to do with transitioning programs in general to a virtual environment, we kind of developed some guiding principles. What are some of the key things that we need to think about, and mainly considering safety and the well-being of all of our constituents? Safety is one of our core values at the American Chemical Society. So this became the foundation in terms of what we were going to stand on as we thought about transitioning programming to a virtual space. We also want to make sure that we're focusing on the specific needs of our educators, our students, and other learners within our community, and then also providing access. As I share with you momentarily, it is important that we make sure that all of our constituents are able to participate in the virtual environment efficiently and effectively. So we also talked about how do we encourage offline experiences? What will be resources that we will need to make available so that everyone could adequately participate? And then building community. You know, the virtual space can be lonely. Working from home, as I'm sure many of you have imagined, can be lonely. So you look forward to your Zoom calls, which are taking the place of walking down the halls and meeting with colleagues and coworkers. So we wanted to make sure that those who are coming into our learning environments were also having a sense of community. So looking forward, some of the actions that we took to address COVID-19, really we needed to acknowledge the circumstances and the challenges that our constituents were going to be faced with. This stems from faculty trying to teach their regular classroom curricula. And this deals with high school teachers not knowing if their students would have access to the materials that they were going to make available. We also had to think about increasing the access to our digital resources. We did make some of our materials free that ordinarily are behind our firewall. So specifically resources from the American Association of Chemistry Teachers, which caters to grades K to 12. Then also we look for partnerships. Who could be partners for us to help us to carry out the work? What universities, what other academic agencies, who do we need to talk to make these things possible? And then how do we facilitate connections and conversations to also allow for success? And then adapting our programs. I think that's the one area where we were not positioned to carry out all of our activities from a remote or virtual standpoint. But as Erica just mentioned, it was necessary to pick that up very quickly and to move forward. And I do want to mention too that TI, the producer of the calculators, did help us with one of our programs, our Chemistry Olympiad program, and they did provide some calculators for our students who took that exam virtually. But what I want to focus on today is our Project Seed virtual summer camp. So Project Seed is a program that's been around for over 50 years. It provides economically disadvantaged students with a hands-on laboratory experience in the summer. It's for students who are entering into the 11th grade or the 12th grade, so this is a high school-based program. So when we were forced with COVID, we were actually in the middle of selecting the sites. Students typically participate in Project Seed around the country. We have hosts that are in pretty much every state, including Puerto Rico. So we do have quite a few number of students who participate. It's typically around 400 or so. So our staff, as we were talking about this, the team was like, what are we going to do? How are we going to continue to provide this activity? And mainly, I think, as Michael mentioned in his presentation, the students do receive a stipend when they participate in Project Seed. And for many of them coming from an economically disadvantaged background, this stipend makes a significant difference in terms of what they can provide for their family throughout the summer. But additionally, it also shows them that chemistry is a path forward in terms of a career perspective and one where they can, make a decent amount of money. Kids are interested in what is going to be my pay in the end. So it's something that we also like to introduce them to. So the Project Seed program typically, it runs throughout the summer. We have had over 11,000 student participants since 1968. You see here on the screen the mission, and as I mentioned, we do have over 400 students who typically participate at about 100 sites. The students are typically able to work side by side with volunteer scientists on research projects. So they're definitely getting that hands-on experience. They're learning about chemistry, they're learning about safety, they're learning about the entire research process. And then one of the most important pieces is that they have that face-to-face mentor experience. So this was something that we were really concerned about and wanted to make sure that we did not lose that with a virtual component for the program. One piece that we are still thinking about, as shown here, the middle pocket, is students are able to present the results of their research through a poster session at our national meeting. So our national meeting is going virtual this year as well. So we're thinking about how do we give the students an opportunity to present their learnings as we move forward. Some of the program benefits is outlined here at the bottom of the slide. You see the stipend. So they do get between $3,200 and $3,800 for the summer. And that generally depends on if they are a first-time student or a returning student. But then you think about this from a sustainability standpoint, they are then able to apply for a college scholarship. So that's something that we definitely want to keep in place because it does help these students to think about what is the next step after Project Seed and how can ACS continue to support them. So the scholarship opportunity that we have does allow for that. So then it came down to how are we going to transition all of this to a virtual opportunity for the students and how can we continue to serve 400 students. So we were able to create a virtual camp that actually is going to launch in early July. The significant difference here is that one, they're of course not going to get the hands-on opportunity, but what they are going to get is the basic information about research, thinking about laboratory safety and the activities associated with that, ethics in research. How do you read a technical paper? How do you really digest that information and then leverage that within a real lab setting? How do you make connections between small projects and the overarching research goal? So the students will still be engaged in chemistry while they won't be engaged in the hands-on aspect. This is a very critical and important component that the average high school student is not going to get. So we're pleased that we're going to be able to provide them with this opportunity and this true introduction into research within the chemistry space. Then also we're going to talk to them about professional etiquette, college readiness. We want to make sure they are prepared to take that next step. So we will be providing resume and personal statement reviews, really helping them to think about the college application process, and then about communication strategies and tips. So these are bonus things we will be able to offer now that we are virtual. They will have opportunities to take asynchronous courses as well as synchronous courses, and they're going to be together kind of in a camp structure. We tried to make it fun since these are high schools. So we're setting up kind of, if you think about a Boy or Girl Scouts camp, they will have a group in which they will associate with on a regular basis. They will have a cabin, so to speak, and each cabin will have cabin leaders. An opportunity that this presented for us was to be able to hire cabin leaders who are undergraduate and or graduate students within the STEM fields. And with that, we're able to also pay them. So we are looking at former Project Seed students to serve in those roles. We're looking at ACS scholars to serve in those roles and other students who have succeeded and who have overcome challenges to get to where they are, because we know they'll be able to relate to these students who may be coming from backgrounds that are somewhat challenging for them to overcome certain situations. So we'll have the campsites, and then we'll have a campsite manager who's an ACS volunteer or a staff person, and they'll be pulling together the campers on a regular basis. So 320 students are the number that we will be able to serve. They will continue to get a stipend. Then an added benefit, because we went virtual, we're providing those who need with a Chromebook. We're also giving them a MiFi connection. So we partnered with our internal information technology team to ensure that we could ship the Chromebooks out, that we could ship the MiFi connections, and that students can actually keep those tools. So it's not something we're expecting them to come back. So they kind of get a bonus. They're getting the stipend as well as the technology that's needed to support their participation within the camp. So it is moving forward ahead. It's going to be a 4-week camp. As I said, they will have the campfire meetings. We're going to bring in some speakers for them to hear from. There are various virtual activities and panel discussions. The cabin leaders will be grading the assignments and providing that feedback. It's really helping the students to think through that research process. So after this year, and we are expecting 100% success with this, we do plan to use this model to open this up for 9th and 10th graders going forward. So provided next year we can do our normal face-to-face program, we will have the face-to-face component for the older students and then use this component here to get the 9th and 10th graders ready to go. And then hopefully that's going to catapult them to be ready to work in the laboratory when they hit 11th and 12th grade. So thank you, and I welcome any questions once we get to that part.
Thank you very much, Latrice. So our final speaker is Dr. Jacqueline Al-Sayed, who is Chief Academic Officer for the American Society for Engineering Education.
Hello. Well, let me tell you a little bit about ASCE. We're the American Society for Engineering Education, as I said, and we have members from across all disciplines in engineering. So chemical engineers, aerospace engineers, biomedical engineers, just everyone. And we also have members from K-12 all the way up through R1 university faculty, and also corporate members. So I chose this slide to give a little background on engineering. When people think engineering sometimes, and they think hands-on, it was kind of like when I was a student and CAD was just starting. And as a faculty member, we started to really use more of our online tools. And so this picture sort of represents what is engineering today. We've gone through the process of changing from destructive testing to online testing, so that the tools at this point are phenomenal, and we can do most all of our work virtually. So that makes it perfect that we'll be able to actually transition. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that engineering is a little bit different than science, and it is a science, but it's also an art, because engineering is definitely creating, inventing, design, test, develop, and manufacture products. So you can imagine that that internships would be very important, right? Experiential learning is very important. And so it is. In fact, and most engineering programs, internships or cooperative education is a mandatory graduation requirement. So here we see that this current situation with COVID could become and is a potential barrier to workforce development in the area of engineering. So what we see in our campuses is that, yes, there are students who are unable to find internships. I have a graph here. The number of internships has actually decreased about 50% overall. We've had some wonderful example of virtual internships, but the maximum impact of COVID is actually a 50% increase in internships. And for engineering students, that is significant, because without an internship or cooperative education, which are very similar, this is a graduation requirement they cannot fulfill. And so what happens then, the students are actually changing around their courses, so that they're going to take, instead of, if their internship got canceled, they're going to take courses hoping that they'll be able to get their graduation requirement of an internship later. Or the campus is trying to find some substitution, which is really not optimal. Another thing that is important is that, I think as was mentioned before with access, is that engineering is a degree that in one generation can help a family come out of poverty. So just like all STEM degrees, these are very important in our culture. One of the things in some other research is that engineering, in their programming, we do have ABET accreditation. So you just about have to have accreditation by our accrediting body to have engineering degrees. And so what we've seen in the research is that because almost all students have to take internships at some point in their career, we get a lot of feedback from industry, and largely the industry is saying, technical skills are great. These students are great, but the growth area are the soft skills or professional skills, like one of our speakers mentioned before, which is very, very important, right? Communication, teamwork, all of those things are very important in order to be able to have inclusive engineering teams that will be able to have optimal designs. So I think some of the best practices that we've seen in engineering education, and I'm a former provost at a primarily Black institution, and this can be generalized across STEM in general, is that internships have to be designed intentionally with learning outcomes. And so what we've seen so far in some of these great exemplar examples is that is actually the case. Sometimes people think that we'll just have a student go to any place and they're going to learn what they need to learn. But the important thing is that they are intentionally designed. And so when we have them intentionally designed, that means we are making sure the students are getting what they need in order to make the leap into their job. Now, another thing is there is a theory for experiential learning. It's plan, do, reflect, learn. And sometimes we forget the reflection part. There is a saying that says students don't learn from experience, they learn by reflecting on experience. And reflection is something that can be taught and learned. And so it's also very important to not only use learning outcomes, which is intentionally designing, but also making sure that we're covering all the bases with our learning theory, because that's the way a brain learns. So some of the learning outcomes that any internship, and you've seen some of them today, is going to have technical skills, soft and professional skills, some type of orientation to the workforce, and networking with professionals in the field. We've seen some marvelous examples, even beyond those that were mentioned today, when we look at remote internships. So there are some, as you can see from the pictures I showed, there are internships that can just be transitioned seamlessly into remote work, like all of us are working remotely right now, and using virtual analysis and virtual project management tools. There's also another model that are micro internships, and that is for a shorter time period, and it's more project-based or gig-based kind of climate, which also helps students as well. There's also, like Google is using open source internships where students are working collaboratively on open source projects. That's also a great way to go. And there's entrepreneurship where students work on inventing something, a product or a process, then they create a startup and a plan for commercialization. Those are all interesting ways. Now, the opportunities that we're seeing right now are that virtual internships can focus on the professional skills and networking. It's just very important for students to have mentors that are accessible and that you have built-in communication, because the unintentional communication that might have happened when students are with professionals in the field doesn't happen. So it has to be more intentionally designed, and those type of opportunities need to take place. Now, students that have access barriers, for example, they don't have a car, or they can't afford a new suit, or something like that, even if they're being paid. One thing about having a virtual internship is that you don't need a car. You know, you do need a laptop though. So that comes to the point that, as was discussed, that they need to have broadband access, they need to be able to have a device, and these are things that need to be supported so that all of our students do have access to what they need for their graduation requirements. But also another opportunity is that students right now can work in authentic global teams without any travel barriers. So everybody's online and everybody's working, and they can have that global experience. And an internship during COVID, really, I read, is that from a quote, that it was a crash course in adaptability, which, by the way, is an industry 4.0 skill, and also a post-COVID workplace skill that we'll all be transitioning to. So some of the federal policy implications of our movement and our pivot to remote internships is that it'd be great to approve more federal funding for undergraduate research opportunities, internships, postdocs. Also, more federal funding for online engineering and STEM educational research so that we can capture and hone all the wonderful ways that we can learn online. Also, approval for increased broadband, laptops, devices for STEM students at all levels of education. And finally, it'd be great to reauthorize the Higher Education Act and help us all do our job better. So thanks so much for listening today, and I look forward to the question and answer period.
Thank you, Dr. El-Sayed. So thanks to our panelists. We've got some time for questions, and I thought I would just review a couple of questions that have already been asked and answered in the chat. So the first question was around how could the federal government support the scalability of virtual internships, especially to ensure equitable access? So Michael, you answered this question. I'll just give you a chance to briefly elaborate on your answer.
Yeah, so when thinking about equity and we're talking about internships, then there's issues, as were just highlighted, related to I don't have internet access, I don't have access to a laptop, and impacting a lot of students. And I think also we need to recognize that in general, internships, especially in STEM, especially in software engineering, often are not entry level. Many of them are assuming that you already have a lot of skills. With COVID, there's a lot of soft skills, professional skills that students from more privileged backgrounds, from top computer science or top programs are more likely to have than students who have lower academic confidence, who have less access to professional mentors. And so we see a lot of students from different rural backgrounds or schools that generally are not the top choice for different companies to recruit out of, where a virtual internship is also inequitable. And so we also have a recommendation where it's not just about the internship, it's about what's the pathways into the internship. And there's a lot of these pre-internship programs that are now virtual. For example, the one that we're helping to run this summer is Facebook University. Freshman and sophomore focus, I'm not yet ready for an internship. So can we build pipelines into internships, which are the primary source of how companies make their entry-level hires in these technical careers? So strong recommendation for government to see if they can subsidize and help to support the creation or the expansion of these programs that used to be a couple hundred students could scale to multiple hundreds or thousands based on not having the same cost structure. Also, I would love to see if government were able to be a participant. Governments are major employers. They have an opportunity to lead by having their own virtual internship programs that can be engaging STEM workers, that can also double as making more of our engineers to understand and be familiar and be passionate about improving government.
So would any of our other panelists like to add to Michael's response?
James, I'd like to add, I think that the access point that Michael referred to is critical here. You know, as we think about our rural areas particularly, we know that the teachers are struggling with educating their students. So we can only imagine what the struggle is to have a student who's home trying to really access an internship or to even have opportunity to an internship. So I think where the federal government can provide funding in that regard. And then I think the other component, not only introducing them to careers within the federal government, but thinking about mentors who can come from the federal government space. I think we have an opportunity for students to gain a better understanding of what the federal government does, as well as the career opportunities through mentorship type of programs.
Anyone else? Dr. El Sayed, I wanted to follow up on one of the statistics that you showed of the decline in the number of internships. And this is sort of a question I'd like all the panelists to weigh in on. What's our constraint in offering virtual internships as different from the constraints for how many traditional internships we can offer?
I think that the major constraint is that industry doesn't really know how to do it. You know, they were pivoting and having their own workers go online. At the same time, then they need mentors, and so just the bandwidth of their employees is less. And basically, it still has to be designed, or they have to come think about how they're going to do this, how they're going to have students have a meaningful experience, and they just didn't have time in that short amount of pivot to do that. And so that's where you know, a lot of university professors, I was at Kettering as a professor, which had mandatory experiential learning. And one of the things that I realized is that industry loves it if faculty will tell them, this is what we would like the students to do at this level. And they don't have to then come and think of it on their own. They're very willing to have that collaboration between the educational experts and industry, and they actually seek it out.
Others? Erica, I couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I I agree with Jackie. In fact, I can just think about how everything played out within TI. Back in March, when we were having all of this situation with COVID, I got a phone call from our talent management director asking for my feedback as to how should we proceed with internships. And you know, if you think about it, as a director or a supervisor, it's daunting to think that you will have to ramp up interns virtually. Folks that have never been experienced how corporate works, how TI works. So from our perspective, we felt that that was going to be a huge task, right? So we were looking and analyzing different ways to make this program successful. But I cannot lie, and I can tell you that the first time that this idea was brought up to me, I was jumping up and down of excitement to make this possible. It came across as a very difficult, daunting task to begin with. Now, what we learned during the process was that honestly, as Jackie mentioned, a lot of the engineering that we're doing nowadays can be done through tools. The tools that we have right now are so sophisticated that you barely need a lot of hardware or a lot of access to hands-on equipment. But I think it came to us as a realization of just putting all of this virtual training in place. Now, going back and thinking, hey, we were in March having these discussions, and right now we are in June and we have 700 interns in TI successfully working on projects. It's just an amazing thing to think. But if I think back in retrospective, really our internship remained similar. It's the same. What we had to put together is just compile all the training, make sure that we have access to all that training virtually, and make sure that we have programs that had clear objectives, as again Jackie mentioned as well, to make sure that we were developing our interns the right way. So to answer your question, I feel a lot of the dropping on internships this summer was because this was new to a lot of corporations, and we had a decision to make pretty quickly as to, hey, do we go forward or do we stop and we cancel internships this summer? And so sadly, I mean, a lot of corporations made the decision to cancel, and that's why the trend went down, right?
I just wanted to follow up from your last bring it back to your last question, James. And so this is a time, because look at all these wonderful things that are happening, pocketed across industry, right? This is a time to capture all these wonderful things that have been innovated during the pivot to COVID, and then share it widely. You know, and people can customize these models into their own companies. But that goes back to federal funding for STEM education. So the faculty would be able to capture these and be able to share them and work with industry and then disseminate it broadly.
Anyone else?
Yeah, James, if I can add to that, I think one of the challenges here that we face, and I think we're a little bit unique in that we are the host organization for internships that are held at other sites. So early on when COVID first hit, sites, of course, started backing out for the year. So we had to figure out how could we lower the barrier of entry for the sites to still participate, and what would that look like. So we had to actually develop the internship program and not to rely on our sites to develop the experience for the students. So ordinarily that would have been something that we would not have been a part in. We would have helped them to get the students, to place the students, and of course to provide the funding. But this placed us in a position of actually taking on more of the responsibility than what we normally would have. So I think thinking about that transition and the ramp up is something that now has positioned us to be able to continue this forward. Getting through this first year and the lessons learned are going to be very beneficial for us as we move into 2021 in the future to be able to offer virtual experiences for internships.
Anyone else? Frank? Michael?
Yeah, I would just say that I think there's also an opportunity to think about how we look at internships in their entirety, right? Very often we see students facing incredible pressures to get internships earlier and earlier in their collegiate experience, right? You hear some students facing pressure to get an internship in between their freshman and sophomore years, even between sophomore and junior years. And you know, part of that is that industry tends to prioritize such experiences. And I actually think that works against us in a lot of ways, especially when we think about issues surrounding diversity and inclusion within our internship efforts. When we think about individuals who may not have the social capital of someone who grew up in a middle class household with familiarity with a lot of the industries in which we're talking about, we are fundamentally putting those individuals at a disadvantage by saying, wait until later on in your collegiate experience, whereas those folks that do have the social capital are getting in early. So I think we've really got to do some soul searching and make sure that not only are we offering enough internships, but that we're offering the right internships with the appropriate guardrails.
So Michael, would you like the final word on this one?
Yeah, sure. One of the major challenges, if we think of like what's going to hold companies back from scaling over the next couple of years, it's going to be related to architecting the experience and them hitting the metrics that they're trying to hit. So there's going to be a percentage of intern candidates that you never had to worry about and they were already prepared. But then you have the larger tail of students that require more support, which they won't have because that support was offered informally, organically by just being around a whole bunch of their peers or meeting in lunch with other engineers, mentorship, informal mentorship. So when you're designing effective online experiences, you need to architect all of those different experiences. You can't just assume they're going to happen, but you need to understand when they're going to happen, and then you need a hypothesis of what outcome that will lead to. And so as an example, the internship program we're running this summer, we have a 6-to-1 engineer to student ratio. They're in, or student to engineer ratio, they're in pods, which is a family pod where they are followed throughout the summer program. But then you also need to design an architect around different types of support and tiers of support that you normally would not have to think about in a standard internship. So that architecting that and then thinking about how you scale that experience so it's consistent, but also flexible for the students that are need to overcome additional barriers, additional gaps. I think that's going to be a challenge. And again, the students that you already didn't have to worry about in the internship program, already prepared, I mean, they're gonna be fine, but what I'm really interested in, what about those students that are coming in with additional challenges? How do we make sure that they're able to also be able to have the same level of support they normally have in person?
That's wonderful, and appreciate that comment very much. I think it makes for a fitting last word for this briefing. So we hope this has been an interesting educational experience for the audience, and would obviously welcome your feedback. This session has been recorded, and we will post that to the Coalition's website and put that out probably the next day or two. And let me just finish by thanking all of our panelists. Thank you so much for your time and energy for this, and I look forward to meeting you in person when we're not virtual anymore. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
James.
Thank you.